With Baldur's Gate 5e right around the corner, you might be considering playing a Druid. So the question is, how do you build a Druid effectively? Honestly, at the end of the day, something to keep in mind with Dungeons & Dragons, regardless of which version you're playing, you should build a character you're going to enjoy playing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a min-max character where you try to maximize its usage. With that being said, you're probably here because you want some advice on building a Druid, so I'm going to give you my opinion. So that's the first thing I need to say here. This is my opinion on how you should build a Druid. And couple tips and a couple opinions on different pieces that you can choose when building your character. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons since the early 90s. Usually I was a dungeon master. I've played pen and paper of multiple editions, including 3.0 and 5e briefly. I don't play as a player too often with pen and paper. That's where the video games come into play. But when I'm playing, I'm typically going to play a druid, possibly a wizard, and sometimes a monk. Those are my three favorite classes. I might consider multi-classing. I'm not going to talk about multi-classing in this particular video. Instead, I'm going to talk about just the core build for constructing your character to maximize them as a druid, and some things you might want to take into consideration when you're building them. So to begin with, one of the things I want to point out is choosing your race. I'm going to bring that up. Even though they've already discussed with Baldur's Gate 3 when it comes out, you're not going to get the racial bonuses anymore because they want you to be able to play who you want to play. So I'm going to assume the racial bonuses do impact, just so you can take some things into consideration that you could also bring back with you to pen and paper version of 5e D&D. So the first thing you want to take into consideration is your background. The main reason for your background, in my opinion, is twofold. First of all, you have the role-playing perspective, but then second of all, you're going to get 2 bonus feats. So take into consideration a few things. What is your primary attribute that is going to be effective for a druid? Now, in the case of a druid, it's wisdom. So any sort of feat that has a wisdom check for your proficiencies is recommended or advised. Which ones you pick, completely up to you. So let's take a look at a few of these backgrounds. I'm going to hide my face for just a second so we can look at this background section in the bottom right. When I'm going through these, when I think of a druid, personally I like to play a healer druid. I like to have that medicine background in many cases, or just, have that general proficiency focusing on a nature type of lore. So for me, I kind of pass on acolyte, charlatan, criminal. None of these really fit for me. Entertainer. Folk hero is usually the one I typically go with in Baldur's Gate 3 because you're going to get handling proficiency and survival proficiency. Both of these, to me, feel very much like druid proficiencies. So you're a champion of the common people, challenging tyrants and monsters to protect the helpless, saving innocents, and imminent danger will make your legend grow. So definitely interesting, and I think Larian Studios was talking about there will be some bonuses to playing your character matching your background. I don't know how true that is, but you might actually consider that. So like there is this inspiration points that you can get, which allows you to do rerolls, and apparently those can come from your main character if you do things that fit their background. Something to keep in mind when selecting this stuff. Guild Artisan, I usually pass on. Noble, I pass on. Outlander is something I would consider. So you grew up in the wilds, makes sense for a druid. Learning to survive far from the comforts of civilization, surviving unusual hazards of the wild will enhance your prowess and understanding. You're going to get athletic proficiency and survival. Something to think about, possibly. Sage is another one I like. I think it fits the whole learned wisdom individual that is out in the woods. Definitely fits a druid for me. You're curious and well-read, with an unending thirst for knowledge. Learning about rare lore of the world will inspire you to put this knowledge to greater purpose. So Arcana and History. These two are not necessarily going to help your druid class, but from a roleplay perspective, I like to consider Sage. Soldier I usually pass, Urchin I pass. So typically, like I said, those are the 3 that I would choose from. I like Folk Hero the best. So let's talk about which race you should choose. So looking at the Wood Elf and the Dwarf, specifically the Gold Dwarf, are usually the 2 that are recommended because you get a +1 to Wisdom, meaning the highest you can start out in your Wisdom is going to be choosing a Wood Elf or choosing a Dwarf. The only exception to this is a human, because a human's pretty much going to get a +1 to everything. There's also a gnome. I think there's a gnome that also gives you a +1 to Wisdom, and I don't remember which one it is off the top of my head, because I typically don't play a gnome. No, intelligence, so it is not the gnome. I wonder if it was the halfling. No? Okay, so let's completely rule those out. So typically, like I said, you want to consider probably a Wood Elf or maybe a Gold Dwarf. Those are the two that are going to give you that +1 wisdom bonus, because you want to maximize that wisdom bonus, because a lot of your proficiencies, a lot of your savings throws, and your spell casting is all based around your wisdom. So you want that to be as high as possible for a druid if you want to go the min-max route. Humans is also something to consider just because they get +1s everywhere. Again, keep in mind when Baldur's Gate 3 actually releases, you're not going to get any of these. So the other reason that you would choose a race is the aesthetics, and then there's also the fact that you get these side proficiencies. So for the Wood Elf, you're going to get all of these racial features. You're going to get proficiency with all these weapons. You're going to have Dark Vision, Fey Ancestry. You're going to get Mark of the Wild, which I think fits Druid greatly, right? You were raised to blend into your natural surroundings. You gain proficiency in stealth, which is pretty cool. Racial bonus speed, that's just their movement speed, basically. Now, you also have half-elves, which you can consider because you get bonuses that you get to choose and select. So doing a half-wood elf would not be a horrible idea. You don't get all of the weapon proficiencies, but you would still get your Fleet of Foot and Mask of the Wild. In this case, you're going to get a +2 charisma bonus, which doesn't necessarily help the druid class. Dark Vision, everyone says you should not choose a human because you want Dark Vision, and a lot of the sub-races do give you Dark Vision. You also have the ability to put a +1 in Wisdom, and then something else that you think would fit your druid. And it will star and highlight for any of the classes you choose. When you're choosing these stats, it'll show you which one is your primary stat. You also see that on the far left as well. This is the pre-release early access character creator, so it will be a little bit different when the full game releases, so keep that in mind while we're going through this as well. So what I personally like to play for role-playing purposes is I will usually go with a human. This is how I usually make my human druid look. I eventually will be able to choose their body type as well to make them bigger, more muscular if I wanted to, and change their overall build, which is going to be kind of cool. I like humans. It's just something that comes natural to me. It's what I like to roleplay as, so typically human druid's my go-to. If I was going to choose something else, I do like half-elves. And like I said, the wood half-elf is definitely something to consider, but for some reason I think drow are really cool. Now here's the thing with drow, and something to consider if you're doing a half drow. Now with, excuse me, let me grab some water as I'm recording this video. Now when it comes to half drow characters, you're going to get bonuses instead of like the Wood Elf, which is going to give you the Fleet of Foot and Mask of the Wild. You're going to get spells for free. The first cantrip you start with is Dancing Lights, which will light up an area. It's kind of a cool cantrip, and cantrips can be cast infinite number of times, but the next spell that you get built in as a drow is actually Fairy Fire. Now, Fairy Fire can already be learned by a druid, but it's kind of cool that you don't have to have it pre-prepared because it's already always prepared just by being a drow. And Fairy Fire is useful because it marks your targets, makes them easier to hit. So it allows you to have a bonus when attacking for your whole party unless they pass the savings throw, because there is a savings throw against Fairy Fire. So that's kind of interesting, something to think about. Dwarves here, like you could go with a shield dwarf because Constitution, and we'll talk about that in a minute, could be kind of important, but the gold dwarf has that built-in wisdom and has the Constitution. So the biggest thing between the shield dwarf and the gold dwarf is actually a +2 in strength versus a +1 in wisdom. And we're going to talk about the abilities here in a second, and there's a reason why a +2 in strength might not be a horrible idea. The worst part here is the fact that you don't get that +1 the wisdom, meaning you can't get it as high as possible. I believe the cap is 15, unless you have that bonus which allows you to get to a 16 when you're creating your character. Something to keep in mind. So yeah, those are my recommendations there. I would go with a wood elf, possibly consider a human, a half elf who's either a half wood elf, or for flavor there's other options, or a dwarf. Elf, dwarf, human, half wood elf. Those are probably your best options for maximizing your druid when you're first building them out. Appearance completely is irrelevant. You just make them look how you want to make them look. Class we've already talked about with druid. So the first thing you have to choose when you've decided on a druid, you've decided on a race, you've customized how they looked, is your starting cantrips. So let's look at these cantrips and talk about them briefly. What I personally like to do is I like to take, Produce Flame and Shillelagh. Those are the two I prefer to take because you get a choice of which circle druid you want to play. Circle of the Land or Circle of the Moon. And apparently, when they do the release of the full game, you also have Circle of Spores to consider. I will probably play Circle of the Land all the time. It is my favorite, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail in a second. So if you're taking the approach from Circle of the Land, you're basically going to get a whole bunch of spells. You're going to get extra spells that you're able to prepare. You're going to be able to choose additional spells. You get an additional cantrip early on, and you have the ability to do this recovery. So you have this arcane recovery type of power, and I forget what it's called for the druid, but basically it allows you to replenish spell slots so you can cast more spells. They're all about casting. With that in mind, I feel like protection is very important. So if you have Shillelagh, you can actually enhance a stick or a torch, a club, a staff, anything you want, and you can also have a shield in the offhand. Even with a staff, the Shillelagh actually allows you to hit with a bonus based upon your wisdom modifier. So having more wisdom also helps you hit harder as well. With this being a cantrip, you can pretty much keep your weapon empowered every time before you're about to swing it. Really powerful and effective if you don't plan on being in wild shape all the time. So for a land druid, it's almost a must, in my opinion, unless you are just not going to use one, because you can still use a spear, you can use a scimitar, you can summon a flame blade, which I would use your spells elsewhere, but you have different options as well. I still feel like Shillelagh is pretty important and pretty powerful, and it scales with your leveling, so that's usually a recommendation I go for. Produce Flame I like for 2 reasons. 1, it's like a built-in torch. 2, it's really cool looking. And 3, you can throw it and hit people with fire. You can also use this if you were to summon entanglement on the ground. You can actually throw the fire onto it and set it on fire. Or if somebody puts grease on the ground, you can set that on fire with your Produce Flame. So you can actually ignite things with this spell as well. So it's kind of like your distant range spell, and with being a cantrip, you can cast it over and over and over again. Now, you can miss when you throw it, but I like it personally. I like to be able to throw that fire. The only other 2 cantrips that I really, really like is Thorn Whip, because you can pull people off of ledges and kill them. It also does some pretty good damage there. So it's definitely something worth considering to take with you, either from the get-go or on your first level up. And then Guidance. Now, Guidance is kind of a mixed bag for folks. What you're going to do is when you are rolling for success on any of your dialogue choices, Guidance allows you to roll an extra 1d4 and add that as a bonus to your roll, meaning you can be more successful in your dialogue options. Many characters have Guidance. Some people will take Shadowheart with them and have her cast Guidance, and then you don't need it for your main character. I personally, playing as a land druid, will take Guidance when I choose Circle of the Land. So I'll start out with Produce Flame, I'll get Shillelagh, and then I'll get Guidance on my first choice of getting that extra cantrip. So I will cast Guidance with my main character, because I'm going to have them there the whole time anyway. And what I will do with Shadowheart is I'll actually have her cast her, I believe it's called Shield of Faith, which gives you a +2 to your AC. So if you have a shield and medium armor and Shield of Faith, you can actually have a 19 AC that's active. And since that's a concentration spell, you lose that if she casts Guidance. Guidance might be infinite, but Shield of Faith is actually, I believe, a level 1 spell, so it takes up a spell slot. Now, it'll stay until you break concentration or you do a long rest. So for those reasons, I would rather put Guidance on my Druid and use Shield of Faith to buff up his armor class, make him more tanky. The other items, the Poison Spray and the Resistance, I'm not a huge fan of. I mean, yeah, the poison damage is kind of cool, and maybe if you're playing for aesthetic purposes, but overall, I don't see it as being better than the other cantrips, in my opinion. So I personally will probably skip that most of the time. Resistance, same thing here. Magically bolster a creature's defense. It receives a +1d4 bonus to savings throw. That could come in handy. It is something that you could consider. It's active for 10 turns and it's concentration, so if your concentration is broken, you lose it. So yeah, for me, resistance and poison spray are stuff I pass on. That's how I typically will build my cantrips for my druid. Going down here to prepare spells. The cool thing about druids is once you unlock a spell tier, in this case level 1, you have access to all the spells, can change them pretty much at any time, and you can rest to get your spell slots back, or use your special spell. It's like a recovery meditation spell that allows you to regain spell slots, which also scales with your leveling as a Circle of the Land druid. So which one of these spells do I consider to be most effective, and what should you think of taking? Now, the first thing to mention is a lot of druid spells are concentration spells, which means Constitution is an important stat, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also you can only have one concentration spell active at a time. So you can cast your Guidance, but then you cast one of these and it's gone. That's fine, because Guidance is usually for dialogue options, but you can't really have Fairy Fire and Entanglement at the same time, or Mist and Entanglement at the same time. So when you're picking, in my opinion, it's usually a good idea to pick maybe one, possibly two concentration spells, and then pick other ones that are damage-based, possibly healing-based. So something to keep in mind and consider. Now, you will get more spells that you can have prepared at one time in the future. And as I'd mentioned, if you take something like a drow, you'll have an additional one. Depending on what racial class you go with, you're going to have an additional spell that's always prepared as well. So that's kind of a neat idea. With Circle of the Lands, you can also choose a type of land. Now, some people will choose something like Underdark, which I actually do choose, which gives you Web and Misty Step, 2 spells you do not get as a druid, and they're always prepared. Now, you could pick a land that gives you spells that are already in your spell list, but they're already prepared. So you can have those prepared in addition to 4 different ones from your spell list. So it is okay to choose a Circle of the Land with a land type that gives you spells you already know. The interesting thing about 5e is as you get your next land spells, you can choose a different land. In 5e in the classical pen and paper version, you have to stick with the same land. If you choose the Underdark, all your spells are based upon the Underdark. So that's something to keep in mind too when you're picking your circle. In 5e, there's a little bit more flexibility. So what do I think of these spells? The Animal Friendship is neat, but honestly, it's more of a roleplay thing in my opinion. It basically charms a beast so it doesn't attack you. I think it'll still attack your party members though. So it's kind of neat from the whole druid aesthetic. I don't really take it ever, but it's there. Charm Person for the same reason. I just kind of avoid those 2 spells. Create Water is a great utility spell. You can make water disappear and be created. If you are wet, or your enemies are wet, and you hit them with a lightning or electric damage spell, it's amplified because they're wet. You can also put out fires. So in the very beginning on the Mind Flayer ship, there's parts that are on fire when you're trying to pick up the bodies. You can throw water over it by creating water, and it'll put it out and you can walk past without being set ablaze. Kind of cool. So there are reasons to have Create Water, but it's mostly a utility thing or an amplification thing inside of combat. Something to keep in mind. I do take Create Water a lot. Heal. I'm sorry, specifically Cure Wounds. I apologize. Cure Wounds, healing in 5e, as I've heard it explained by many folks, you don't really out-heal damage. It's not advised. You could try that, but most people advise focusing more on killing or control within the battle than for healing during battle. Healing outside of battle is okay. I usually do not use Cure Wounds. You can use other things, which I will talk about in a minute here, as well as healing potions, which are rare. You want to save your healing potions and use spells which can be regenerated. For a level 1 spell, I typically don't take Cure Wounds. Even though I like playing a healing druid, I will usually use their medicine, and there's other utilities in here with the spells that I think are more worthwhile. The next one here is Entangled. Entangle is like a bread and butter for me. Having an area that can wrap up and put vines around your enemies and keep them from moving, difficult terrain. If you put it in pinch areas, they're forced to walk through it. It is a concentration spell, which means if you hit, you get hit, there's a concentration check, and if you fail it, the vines disappear. But you can set these ablaze with your Produce Flame, or maybe one of your wizards or sorcerers can actually throw their fire bolt, and they can light it on fire too. So there's different ways to light it on fire. You can throw candles into it. It's kind of cool that you can both have a grabbing area as well as an area that's on fire. And when it's on fire, you don't have to have concentration anymore. It gives you your concentration back. So that's a nice utility spell. It's kind of a go-to for me. A lot of Druid players do seem to like Entangled a lot. I do highly recommend taking it. Next one is Fairy Fire. It's also concentration. I prefer Entangle over Fairy Fire, but Fairy Fire, if they fail a savings throw, they'll be having like little lights dancing over their head, makes them an easier target to hit for your whole party. It's neat. It's not my go-to. I would consider using it, but I prefer Entangle instead, and like I said, I don't like to take 2 concentration spells. Unless I want to have them both prepared and decide which one I think would be more effective. Because Entangled, I think Flyers can't be Entangled, or if they can, they have a easier time having a savings against Entanglement, if I remember correctly. Fog kind of blinds and obscures, so if someone's about to go down, you can put Fog on them. You can put it on the enemies who are ranged so they can't hit you unless they walk out of the fog. There's reasons to use Fog. It's kind of a utility, but again, it's a concentration spell. I'm not a huge fan of it, so I typically don't take it. Goodberry. In my opinion, it's one of the most broken healing spells in 5e. A lot of people don't like Goodberry. I don't know why. It's like producing health potions in your inventory. So you'll have berries appear, which you can separate and give out to different team members. You eat the berries and you heal randomly for a certain number based upon your levels, like a 1d4 hit points. You can have 1 to 4 hit points for every berry you take. You can have 1 or 2 and save them. You can cast a spell twice and have 8 berries. You know, so you can build up all these berries and pass them out for healing. It is a great idea for in between combat healing. I would not use this during combat, but I usually take Good Berry. It's a go-to for me. One of the best healing spells in the game is Healing Word, because you can do it from a distance. So if your friend is downed and they're not actually dead, you can use Healing Word and they get right back up. You can also cast it on someone who's low on hit points and heal them from a distance. The distance and the range and the fact you can pick up a companion, I take Healing Word on anyone who can handle it, and my Druid will always have Healing Word. Jump is neat. Being able to move around, it's okay. I usually don't take it, but for positioning in combat, it's actually worth taking if you know how to use it. Long Strider allows you to move better if you're further away. It's something to consider, but I think there's better spells, but it is neat. Speak with Animals is going to be an outside of combat spell for the most part, but there are going to be animals that you can speak to throughout the game. I like this because you can stay in your human form and speak to animals, but as a druid, you can wild shape and speak to them as well. So you can choose to use wild shape, or you can choose to use speak with animals. Remember, wild shape, you get your charges back as a land druid or a druid of the moon if you are going to do a short rest. So you have 2 charges, you use them both, do a short rest, you have 2 charges again. So that's kind of neat. I don't know. Speak with animals, like again, it fits the druid aesthetic, but wild shape is another option. So you have some options here, but I think it's neat to have. I usually pass on it. Thunder Wave, great option because it's an offensive damage spell. There's no concentration. And if you know how to use the height and stuff in battle, you can push people off ledges and do damage to them too. Either way, it's going to do damage though. So it's a wide damage spell. It is pretty cool. It's definitely worth taking. Just usually not my go-to. So I usually will set my character up starting out like this. And like I said, you can change it at any time. Always Healing Word, Good Berry, Create Water, and Entanglement. Now at the very beginning here, I don't necessarily need Good Berry. So when I level up to level 2, I will definitely take Good Berry. But at the get-go here, sometimes I might take something like Fairy Fire, or consider taking Thunder Wave instead for the tutorial area. Just something to think about. So there's just a few thoughts on some of the beginning parts. Obviously, we can do future videos, but I don't want to make this video too long, spending time talking about spells and how you build them. So instead, we'll jump on the skills. We have Animal Handling and Survival given to us because of Folk Hero, so we don't need to worry about them. And like I said, Animal Handling is Wisdom. It fits the Druid, and your Wisdom helps you as well, and you see this is inherited. Survival is also Wisdom, so both of these great choices. Insight, even though it's a Wisdom and I like it, I actually will usually take Insight away and give Medicine, which is also Wisdom because of my playstyle. Nature I leave. It's an intelligence check, but nature is neat. You could consider taking that away and giving it to something else like Perception or Insight, which would probably fit your Druid character better and give you that bonus roll. Just comes down to playstyle. No option here is a bad option. It's just, what do you think is going to fit how you want to play the game? Abilities. Most people, when it comes to Druids, what I like to do is I like to take them all away. I zero them all out, and then I distribute. Something to keep in mind is, even though a lot of people will tell you stuff like, max out your Wisdom. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You don't have to, though. Just be aware that you're going to be less powerful if you choose not to do that. For the Druid, the 3 most important stats, in my opinion, is Wisdom, Constitution, and then Dexterity at last. So if you max out Wisdom and then a Constitution, Constitution's going to help you concentrate and keep focus. However, this is the whole min-maxing or play style. I like to keep my points balanced. For every even number of 2, you get a +1 bonus. So with everything being here at 9, it's a -1. I don't want negative rolls, so I instantly will make everything 10. And I do this for any character I create, any class I create. I put everything at 10 so I have no negatives. Then I take the main stat, I max that out. Makes sense, you get a +3. When you get to an 18, you're actually going to get a +4. So you have to have 2 points in Wisdom added additionally. Now remember, I get a +1 in Wisdom, otherwise I'd be stuck at 15 for creation. So that's important to think about too. I actually will not go to Constitution next. You can use the recommended settings, you don't have to mess around with this. What I actually do, I'm not saying this is the best, is I'll put 2 points in everything. I'll get that bonus of +1 for all my stats. Then I think about what I want to do with my character. Strength is about carrying stuff. I pick up a lot of stuff. You don't need this as a druid, especially if you're going a druid of the moon. You wild shape into a bear. You don't even worry about it. When you're a druid of the moon, you can wild shape extra times. You can use it as a bonus action, so you can literally shift into a bear and attack someone in the same round. I mean, there's so many different options that you can do, and you take on the attributes of the animal you shapeshift into. So if you're a cat, you actually get overburdened a lot. But if you shapeshift into a bear, I mean, you have more strength anyways. You also have a second hit point pool. So even if you're a Circle of the Land Druid, you can cast your spells and then shift into a wolf. You can't attack right away, but then you have your extra hit points to move around as a wolf. When they take away that, the damage turns you back into your normal form, then you can start attacking with your Shillelagh and your spells again. I like to do that. I will cast a spell like Moonbeam or Entangle or something at the beginning of combat, then I change into a wolf as a Land Druid. So with Druid of the Moon, like I said, you can do the same thing. You can cast your spells, turn into a bear, and then attack everyone. And if you do get your hit points down, turn right back into a bear and attack again. You can do the same thing with the Land Druid. You get a second wild shape. You can go back into a shape. You can go into a spider and web them up. Oh, you have all your hit points gone. Turn into a wolf. So you have some utility there with your wild shape, even with your spells involved. Something to think about with your playstyle. With these stats here, though, sometimes I will boost other things for roles, for role-playing. Charisma I don't invest a lot in. Sometimes I'll actually leave charisma at 10. Sometimes I'll put it up to 12. I do like to give a little bit more intelligence because I like to play this wise, intelligent wizard type of druid, like this learned individual that's out in the woods and just studies stuff. So I like to have high intelligence. It doesn't help your druid, but from a roleplay perspective, I like doing it. Then I'll put some more into constitution. So I do look at constitution because of concentration, and having low concentration sucks. When you do Moonbeam or Entanglement, you get hit once and boom, your spell's gone. So you probably want to edge on the side of recommendations, or make sure that you max out. See, even this, I would probably change it and do like a max Constitution and a max Wisdom. Actually, I might even take the Charisma down further. Yeah, putting this up at 15, that up at 15, this up at 16. That, to me, makes a little bit more sense. And then maybe evening this out. Things to think about. And again, originally, your race choices is going to affect your stats here. But since they're taking that away, you can pretty much build however you want. I'm kind of curious what Larian Studios will do with humans. Because one of the bonuses to being a human is you get +1 in everything. Whereas the other races, you get bonus proficiencies, skills, and dark vision. But your stats, you only get bonuses in 2 versus bonuses in everything. So I'm kind of curious where they'll go with that. I would prefer to roll for my stats. You can keep re-rolling as much as you want till you get what you want. But just some things, food for thought, things to consider. There's a couple options for you. Again, I don't know if there's any necessarily wrong way to build. I know not everyone is going to agree with me on the choices that I make. That's fine. You play how you want to play. You don't have to please other people. This might not be too bad. 12, 12, 15, 13, 16, and 10. That might work pretty decent for a druid. You got to go with what is going to make you happy. But those are the why I make some of the decisions that I make. There's some options to go with, and hopefully that helps you with playing a druid. I'll definitely do some follow-up videos of what you do during level up and different things you can do in combat if you're interested. Thanks for watching. Please leave your comments below. Let me know. Are you going to create a druid? If you are, let me know what race you're going to go with and what spells are your favorite. Catch you in the next one.